Hi, it's Dr. Harris, and just wanting to wrap up our discussion of how to handle probability calculations involving the normal distribution in RStudio by talking about the topic of percentiles. So, if just to remind you or possibly let you know, uh, percentiles, a percentile is a 1/100th piece of a group. And so, for example, the 50th percentile would be the observation in a population such that 50% of the observations in the population are less than it. So we also know the 50th percentile as the median. We know the 25th percentile as the first quartile, the 70th percentile as the third quartile. And so, so if somebody scores on a test at the 90th percentile, that means that their score beats 90% of all the individuals, and 10% of the scores by people in the population were higher than that. So just to remind you what a percentile is. So in our example, we want to look at finding in this case, the number of hours spent on social media by a student who logs more than 80% of all students. In other words, we're asking what is the 80th percentile for the number of hours spent on social media by students. And so we want to recognize that this is a little bit of a different situation. In previous examples, we were looking at finding probabilities, and we treated that as area underneath a normal distribution curve. In this case, we're told what the area is, and we're trying to find the range underneath it such that that area is captured over that interval. And in this case, it's going to be, and the interval is going to become, in a percentile calculation, it's going to be the area from the far left end of the distribution up to a given number. So we're trying to find out what's the number, that's the cutoff, where 80% of the area underneath the curve is to the left of that number. So it's a different calculation. If we wanted a probability, we used qnormGC. If we want a percentile, we're going to use a command called qnormGC. So let's take a look at how this is set up. It's going to be very similar in layout to the pnorm command. But in this case, we're going to give a percentage, a probability in this first spot. The region is going to be below. If we're truly looking for a percentile, we give the mean and standard deviation, and we want to look at a graph. So this command, the layout's very similar, but what's different in this case is the number that we give here for the range is going to be a number between 0 and 1, always. Don't put 80 to find the 8th percentile. We're going to put 0.8. So let's verify that this will run in RStudio. Indeed, we get a number, and we get a graph as well. And so we can see that that's the output we have on the next slide. So it gives us the 80th percentile, and the cutoff looks to be at about 23.4. And so the area to the left of 23.4 under this curve that's centered at 20 with standard deviation 4 is 23.4. So how do I interpret this information? So we would say that a student spending 23.4 hours on social media each week is spending an amount of time on social media that's more than 80% of all students, assuming our population is students. So that qnormGC is the command that we're going to use to find percentiles. We can also use it to answer questions like the following. Find the number of hours for a student such that 75% of college students spend more time on social media each week than that student. So this is not a percentile. A percentile would actually be finding the number of hours such that 75% of college students spend less time. It's below. This time we want the number such that 75% of college students are above this student. And so that means we're just looking at this word more right here. That tells us that we're wanting to switch the region from below to above. And in this case, we want 75% to be above this reading. And so we're going to put 0.75 in here. Again, we still supply the mean and standard deviation. We get the graph, and we discover that the answer this time is 17.3 hours. And so we would say that 75% of students spend more than 17.3 hours on social media each week. So using this above computation, it's not a percentile per se that we're finding. However, we could have rephrased or reworded this question so that the word percentile did appear in the question. And so I'd like you to think about that, and we will talk about this idea in class when we get together. So that's what we want to say about qnormGC. And so now we've talked about normal distributions, percentiles, and we will move on to some important inferential statistics ideas when we move to chapter 5.